Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Triangle Area SQL Server User Group's Business Intelligence and Data Science Subgroup. We have the pleasure tonight of Eugene Meidinger, who absolutely does exist and is a person, who is going to be presenting for us. So, Eugene, since you have not been taken over by either robots or Skynet or lizard people, please take it away.
I do want to correct that. I've got my injection port ready for when the AI comes, but it's not active yet. So,
You got to pay for that upgrade.
yeah. All right, cool. And let's see. You said you can see the actual chat, right? So you'll let me know if anything.
Yes. So I'll be
Okay.
able to see chat. What'll happen is that if chat, by the way, chat, this is your opportunity. If you have
Hi,
any
chat.
questions for Eugene at any time, put them in chat, and then at appropriate times, like while he's trying to breathe or say a concept that's relevant, I'll cut him off, just like on a podcast. And
Yeah, he'll cut my
ask
mic
questions.
off. It'll be great. Okay, cool. So this is an advanced introduction to DAX, which is an oxymoron like jumbo shrimp, right? But I think it's an important concept because DAX is difficult to learn, and we'll talk about why. But I just want to clarify that real quick. Hold on. Real quick about me. Okay, cool. I am a business intelligence consultant, so I do consulting on Power BI and Microsoft reporting. I'm a video author for Pluralsight. I have a dozen courses, mostly on Power BI or streaming data. And I'm a Microsoft MVP, which according to them means I like to help the community, like presenting to you tonight for free, no charge. You can reach me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, sadly on TikTok, because I'm trying to do more social media stuff, and my email's down there as well. And like Kevin said, please feel free to post in the chat any questions you have, and I'm more than happy to answer them. Now, the session today is going to be a little bit more disjointed than I usually like because I made some really nice improvements to the beginning as a 20-minute talk, and I've reintegrated into the full hour long, but it might need a little bit of smoothing. So what are we going to talk about? DAX is good at two things. It is good at aggregations and it is good at filtering. And this is so important that it's going to come up at least once or twice again in the talk. And so if you're not doing those types of things, then you shouldn't be using DAX. You should be using Excel or formerly SQL Server reporting services or whatever, right? You really want to be using DAX when you're doing aggregation. So you're looking at KPIs or the whole picture, or you're doing filtering. So if you're not doing one of these things, don't use DAX. Give me 1 second. Let me pull up my presenter mode so I can see what things are coming. Okay, so when we talk about DAX being difficult, one of the things that I like to share with people is this learning curve. DAX starts out seeming pretty intuitive, seeming pretty easy. It's familiar, and the parts that are easy are what are called scalar functions. Just fancy mathematical term for a function that returns a single value. I'm sure Kevin knows the more precise meaning, but the idea is when you're learning about math, you had vectors and scalars. Scalars was a number you scaled something up by, and vector had multiple components. So you think about something like if or and or some sort of concatenation returns a single value. Then you have calculated columns, which we'll talk about. But they work pretty similar to the way that you're used to in Excel. So, hold on one moment. So, let's say, for example, that you want to combine first name and last name to get full name, right? Well, you might use a calculated column to produce that new full name value. And this seems all well and good until, boom, you run into a problem because you have this learning curve that shoots way, way up. And when it shoots up is whenever we start dealing with measures, we start dealing with filtering, and we start dealing with evaluation context. And then it starts to level out. So the goal of this talk is to help you with a lot of the stuff around here in the middle, a lot of the stuff that's in that circle that's where people get stuck or frustrated or start running into issues. So the big question is, why is DAX hard? What makes it difficult? Because whenever I was learning it, I had to unlearn a bunch of things. And it was one of the most frustrating languages for me to work with. So I don't know if anyone in the audience knows German. This is also relevant if you speak Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish, I believe, maybe even Dutch. But I took German in high school. And one of the things about German is because English is a Germanic language, and actually because English steals language from all over the place, we have what are called cognates. So these are words that look pretty much the same in one language and the other. So der Apfel looks like apple, right? And das Buch looks like book. And so you might start getting ahead of yourself and say, oh, das Gift, that looks like poison. The German word of das Gift translates to poison in English. If you want to actually give someone a gift, it would be a Geschenk in German. And so the key takeaway here is DAX may seem like a gift, but it can taste like poison. And so what do I what do I mean by that? So the thing to understand is Excel whispers in cells. It says A2 plus B3, C3 divided by D4, right? It sometimes feels like you're playing a game of bingo. SQL speaks in rows. We're referring to rows, we're doing where statements. Everything happens on the row level. And in fact, that's the way that data is stored in SQL Server. It's stored as a row store. And unless you're using indexes to support it, if you're just reading the data off of the 8 kilobyte pages, you're going to have to read the entirety of the row to get the data. Well, DAX shouts in columns. And that's the important thing to understand is DAX is, if not just a different language, but when it comes to data, a different dialect, right? My uncle Johnny married into the family, and he's very Italian. And it's so funny because when I was young, I went to Sunday school, and he taught one of the classes. And he was very nice and mild mannered and stuff. But then later, when I went to his house and I got to know him, like he's just swearing and using hand gestures and all this kind of stuff, right? And so, like I imagine Dax being like that, especially because two of the most prominent consultants and writers on DAX are Italian. So, what is the problem with a row store database, right? Why did Microsoft go through all of this effort to create the DAX language and the what's called the Vertipack engine, which is a column store engine? So the problem with row stores is this. Imagine for a second that we've got this table, and imagine it's some ERP system, so it's 50 columns wide instead of 3. And I say to you, you know what? I would really love to know what was the most popular color by sales. And I really only care about color and quantity. I don't care about state. I don't care about these 50 other columns that are in my database. So again, if you have a dedicated DBA, you could add a non-clustered index that would have just that information. But if you don't have that, or it isn't indexed, or it's an application system that the vendor won't let you modify, then you have to go row by row by row to get the data that you need. Whereas instead, if you have a column store, well, then you can grab the entire column and you can grab the other column and you have everything that you need, right? So it's really quick and efficient. And when it comes to analytical reporting, this is the type of workload that we deal with very often. Usually we need 1 or 2 columns for numerical pieces, and then we're doing a lot of filtering and grouping with some other columns, but usually not more than a handful. And so column store engines are uniquely designed to support analytical workloads. Another thing is that it's not just that the data is stored in columns, but it's compressed in columns. And so there's 3 types of encoding that occur that help improve compression. So the first one is value encoding. So what that means is I go and get my blood drawn, or I'll go see my doctor at Heritage Valley, and I will get an invoice. And the invoice account number differs depending on who I saw, but it'll be something like 5,238,702. And I can assure you, there's not 5 million people in the greater Pittsburgh area. There's definitely not 5 million customers for this hospital network, this doctor network. And like I said, it's different depending on who I see. And so what happened was you had some IT person who thought it was a good idea to put the department number at the beginning of the account number, because then it's very easy to route who it goes to, just like a zip code or the first 3 digits of your phone number or what have you. And so value encoding says, well, why don't we take the bottom of that 5 million, put it over here, and then just store the delta from there. So we don't need as many digits to store all of the numbers. Another thing is dictionary encoding. Now, I know that you folks down there may not know Punxsutawney Phil, the world's greatest groundhog, but he is our most valuable resident in Pennsylvania, where I'm at. And you can imagine that I have this big book of Punxsutawney Phil, of groundhog facts, and Punxsutawney Phil is one of them. And I have a bunch of facts, and his name repeats 1,000 times. There's probably not that many facts about him, but imagine. Well, there's no reason to write out every single time Punxsutawney Phil, Punxsutawney Phil, Punxsutawney Phil. That's a long name. And so dictionary encoding is basically a hash map or a hash or a map or a dictionary object. It says, okay, every time I see Punxsutawney Phil, I'm going to put the number 1 instead. And so that way, everything gets converted to integers and again, doesn't take up nearly so much space. Finally, we have run length encoding. And so this one is actually dependent on the sorting. Now, you can't control what sorting the engine uses, but you can hint at it based on the order that the data comes in. So let's imagine again, I've got the color column of all the shirts that I've sold, and I want to compress this. Well, if I sort by color, then what I can do is instead of having green, green, or red, 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 I can have blue, comma 1, green, comma 2, red, comma 4. And so this allows me to save tons and tons of space if we're dealing with a small number of repeated values. And so when is that going to happen and when is it not going to happen? When it will happen is if you've done a little bit of denormalization, a little bit of flattening out your data, you're going to have values that repeat a lot, and that's okay. When it's not going to happen is whenever you have unique columns. So think primary keys. Social security number is quasi-unique. Globally unique IDs are usually unique. And so you can imagine that if you include columns that are unique or close to it, that they have a high cardinality, you're not going to get a lot of compression. You can also imagine that the more columns that you add, the worse the compression becomes, because it has to sort one column at a time, but they all have to be coherent, like if you're doing a multi-sort in Excel. And so what that means is the first column that's sorted will get a lot of compression benefits, but the last one's going to be very fragmented because you're basically doing a subsort, right? If we were to go back to state, here we've sorted by color, but you can see that for red, okay, we could sort by state and we could get 2 of those Ohios next to each other, but there's no way for us to get all 3 of them together, right? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Right. Um, so some things, like I talked about, look like they should work easily in DAX, but they can't. So let's imagine that you want to add a month to a date in Excel. Well, all you have to do is add eDate, and then you'll get a number 44,958. Isn't Excel wonderful? Um, if you format it though, what you get is February 1st, 2023, right? So there's a built-in function that does that. Now, if you try to do something similar in DAX, what you get is a blank. So why do you get a blank? Well, the problem is that a function like date add isn't actually taking a value and adding a month to that value. What it's doing is it's taking a column, in this case, the date column from our date table, and it's shifting it 1 month into the future. And so if you're thinking in terms of tables and columns, this is manageable. But if you're thinking in terms of cells or rows, this is very, very confusing. So this is why you have to be very careful if you just directly translate Excel into DAX. And so talking a little bit more about that, one of the most important things that you can learn about Excel or about DAX are evaluation contexts. And so this is one of the most difficult concepts, but I can give you another language example. Imagine I'm having this session and I tell Kevin, "Hey, Kevin, I'm giving a presentation. Can you come watch my session, give me some feedback?" He might say, "I'd love to attend," right? Or if he was feeling very emotional, he might say, I'd love to attend." Or um, if he really wanted some emphasis, he might say, "I'd love to attend." Or if it's Kevin, he might have some quotes and say, "I'd love to attend." All of these use the exact same words. What has changed is the context in which we evaluate them. And DAX is similar. DAX has two types of evaluation contexts. So you can think of this like bold and italics. So first you have a row context. This is bold. This says, look right here. Okay. Look at this specific row and nothing else. And so this comes up when we're dealing with calculated columns, which are one type of way of introducing business logic into our DAX. And the other is iterators. Iterators are like for loops or cursors in SQL. And they are necessary whenever you have to deal with multiple columns to kind of bring them back together. The other type of evaluation context is the filter context. It's like italics. It's like not quite. I know that's what you asked for, but that's not quite what you're going to get. And so this comes up anytime that we're dealing with measures or we're using calculate. So um, this is where it gets a little bit disjointed and I'm trying to sew Frankenstein's monster back together. So a lot of what I talked about was how DAX is column oriented and how this is really, really good for doing aggregations like sum or min or max or whatever, because it's able to scan the data very quickly. It's able to grab the data that it needs. The other thing that it's good at is filtering. So there's two types of filtering that we're dealing with whenever we're dealing with DAX. We're dealing with implicit and explicit filtering. Implicit filtering is filtering that's being done by the user, by the layout, that sort of thing. So imagine you've got a slicer, either here pictured in Excel or in Power BI, or if you've got something that is the cell location or a bar in a bar chart or something like that. Even though you didn't write any code that says, okay, I only want to see the green products like shirts or vegetables or what have you, what you're doing in the report is implicitly applying that filter. Now, what's important is that explicit filtering can override that. And so you can imagine something here where I say, okay, even though, not quite the italics that I talked about, even though you've asked for a specific color like red, I want it to always be green. And so I'll use calculate to take my aggregation and change the color to be green, and it'll overwrite that. Now, you might be asking, why would you ever do this? Like, why wouldn't I give the user what they said they wanted? Well, the answer is usually you're doing something like this as part of a broader comparison. So, for example, you might have something where you want to say, oh, give me the previous year. Even though the user is looking at 2023, show me what the sales were for the year prior. Or maybe I'm doing a part to whole analysis. So maybe I want to know, okay, how does this compare as part of the grand total of sales? Like if I'm looking at green products, what does that compare to everything, right? And so what we're dealing with is the filtering context. That's that italics. And it's a combination of all the user filters, so applied by the slicers, by the bars in the bar charts, the rows in the tables, all this kind of stuff. And you've got basic filters that are associated with specific individual columns that can then be overridden with something like calculate. You can also have table level filters that are more complicated and a little bit harder to add, and they apply to the table as a whole. One of the other things that you can do with DAX that you can't easily do with SQL that kind of blew my mind is you can remove filtering as well. And so the all function removes filters. They've also added another one that's more aptly named called remove filters. And again, you can use it on a whole table or specific columns. So this is a little bit closer to how I might do that part to whole analysis, right? Here I'm saying, okay, give me the total quantity sold, but give it to me for all of the colors. And so we can see over on the left that, even if I'm looking at 9 green products, all colors are going to be 17. And where it becomes interesting is if I were to divide 9 by 17, I would get my percentage of total sales. And so it starts to get more interesting when you start adding bits and pieces to it. Over on the right, though, we can see that I'm only undoing the filtering on a single column. And so for my category column, there's no difference between total quantity and all colors, right? And so one of the things that you're doing a lot when you're working with DAX is you're playing around with these filters, especially when you're doing date-based logic. You want to do year to date, previous year, all this kind of stuff. You're going to be undoing filters and applying new ones all of the time. Now, what if you want to do more than a single column? Well, the problem is if I were to try to do something where I said, hey, I want to know all of the quantities sold for products where I made less than $1, so price minus cost. Well, you'll get this very long error that doesn't even fit in the PowerPoint, right? And the error is not particularly helpful. But what it's trying to say is that you can't use you can only filter a single column based on a simple comparison. And so what we need to use something called an iterator. So basically, anytime in DAX that you want to work on multiple columns at the same time, because it's so heavily optimized for individual column operations, you have to use something called an iterator. So an iterator is, like I said, like a for loop, or it functions a lot like a cursor, and you can have similar performance issues like you might with a cursor. In my experience, very basic iterators are fine as long as what you're dealing with is generally within either the same column or same table, I mean, or it's going downhill on a one-to-many relationship, and you're doing like a row count on a related table or something like that. But the moment you need to start breaking out of that row context by using lookups or something along those lines, or you need to nest iterators, that's when I've seen the most performance degradation. there's a function called filter, and it takes in a table and an expression, and it returns a filtered table. This is also an iterator. So almost any time that you see a function that takes in a table and an expression, there's a good chance that behind the scenes it's an iterator. And filter is stupidly fast. So it all depends on how it's being used, generally speaking. So it's not automatically bad if you're using an iterator. So here's an example here of using the filter function. So instead of trying to do a sum based on the regular filter, what we're doing is we're using calculate and we're doing a regular sum, and we're saying here, apply the filter on the sales table where price minus cost is less than or equal to 1. And so you can see the results here. And so it's a few extra steps, but I think in general, Microsoft is trying to put a safety lock on calculate. If you're just doing basic single column filters against a static value, that's super fast all the time. And so they say, yeah, go ahead. But the moment you need to do anything more complicated, they want you to use a function like filter to be able to add that in. A little bit more about iterators. Pardon me. So as I already said, you're processing tables by row, by agonizing row. And a lot of times this can be expensive to process. And the way that this works is normally when you refer to a column name, it refers to the entire column. But when you're doing it in a calculated column or an iterator, then it creates a row context. So that's that bold that I talked about that it says, look here, right now, right here, this is the information. And a lot of times you may have a filter context and a row context being applied. This is one of the hardest things to understand because, especially when it comes to troubleshooting, there's no step-by-step debugger to be able to see the data in process like you have with Power Query. So with Power Query, you can go through each step and see what the data looks like. As far as I'm aware, there's no good way of doing that with DAX. Now, things have gotten better because they've added support for variables within a measure. So you can stick something in a variable. But a lot of times what I may have to do is break up a measure into intermediate measures and look at them individually. So instead of trying to do just previous year's sales, I will make a sales measure. I'll look at that for the current year. I'll filter the report to the previous year. I'll look at the numbers. I'll make sure that makes sense. And then I'll build another measure on top that's doing the filter manipulation or is doing an iterator or something like that, because it's really, really hard to get your head around it. But again, anytime that you want to refer to multiple columns in the same, multiple fields in the same row, you have to use an iterator. So if you try to do sales or sum of price minus cost to get your margin, it's going to give you an error, right? Because it's just not designed that way. It's designed to be column oriented. So to give you an example, let's say we wanted to see the average gross margin for a given sale. There's two ways that we could do that. So option one is we could create a calculated column and say price minus cost, and we could take the average of that. And so this would work the way that you would expect it to. It's pretty easy to code up. And really the only downside with this approach is that you're now taking up more space to calculate gross margin for every single row. And if it doesn't take up a lot of, technically this is more unit margin, but if it doesn't take up too much space, then that can be fine, as long as you think you're going to reuse this. What you want to avoid, and a trap that a lot of people fall into, is creating a bunch of intermediate columns that don't need to be there, and so they just clutter up the UI. The other way to do it with an iterator is using average X. Now, I don't know what X stands for. I don't know if it's extreme or accelerate or what, but a lot of times they've taken the regular aggregation functions and they've added an X to it. And you can tell by the function parameters that this is an iterator because it's taking in a table and an expression. And so it's saying, okay, go through each row in sales and give me price minus cost. And again, because we're creating a row context, because we're saying, look at just this row, then when I refer to price or I refer to cost, I'm not saying give me the entire column. It's a lot more like in Excel. I'm saying just give me that little cell of data and it loops through. And as you can see below, they have identical results, identical values. And as I said, you need a table parameter to iterate through and they can be costly. Couple other quick things. So one of the things that you should definitely check out when you're playing around with DAX is time intelligence. And so time intelligence requires a date table. A date table just needs to be an uninterrupted table full of dates. You can have other columns that are providing additional information, such as month or year or day. But at a bare minimum, you just need a table that's just a list of dates. It has to be contiguous, which means no gaps, and it can't have null or blank as values. And so what time intelligence functions do is they will manipulate those date filters in an intelligent way, not artificially intelligent, just common sense, artificial common sense. I'm not sure. And many of them are syntactic sugar. What that means is you could code this yourself pretty easily, but it just makes it quicker and cleaner. So here you can see that we're doing dates year to date. And I could write logic that says, okay, what's the, given the current date or given the max and min date of what I'm looking at, give me the beginning of the year, give me the max date of the range I'm looking at. Or I can use this dates year to date function and it'll do that for me. And you can see I'm giving it a date column for my calendar table. And what it's doing is it's manipulating that date filter to just year to date. So time intelligence functions are pretty useful. They can take a little bit of getting used to, and like I said, you need to have a date table. The other interesting feature I want to mention about DAX are quick measures. So these can be a quick way to make DAX formulas. They generate real DAX, and so you say, okay, they're a bunch of templates. You might say, okay, I want to know the minimum of a given category. So what do you want to take the minimum of? In this case, maybe it's forecast. And what's your category? In this case, I have a column called category. And you can see that over on the left, it's giving you this code. And one of the nice things about it is you can look up each of these individual functions and see what they do. And if you look, you see there's min x, which means it's an iterator, which means it's looping through, right? So you can start to pick these apart, and that can be a good way to learn this stuff. They also have in preview something called quick measures suggestions, which everybody knows every new feature has to be built with ChatGPT. And so quick measure suggestions uses GPT-3, not ChatGPT, to generate DAX code based on whatever your request is. Now, I would advise being careful with this because there's no human vetting it. It's not like it's a template made like by a human like we have here, but that also can be an interesting way to learn. So then, just real quick, I want to give a couple book recommendations, and then since we're a bit ahead on time, I'm happy to do a demo or just answer a bunch of questions that people might have, or if everyone's asleep, I can let you back to your rest. So the first book that I want to mention is Analyzing Data with Microsoft BI. This teaches you data modeling, and it just happens to use DAX as the language. And this helped me learn a lot of the fundamentals of what it means to be making a data model, what it means to be dealing with something like star schema or dimensional modeling. They can, this is by Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari, as is the next book. They can be a little bit opinionated. They are really, really big proponents of star schema. They don't like anything resembling, say, like a header and line item approach. I think sometimes that's fine as long as you understand what you're filtering on. But it does, having a pure star schema does avoid a lot of confusion and problems. But this is a short book. It's an amazing one. And even if you don't think you're going to do a ton with DAX, you'll pick up some things in terms of data modeling. So I definitely recommend that. The other book I love is the second edition. It's the definitive guide to DAX, and it is like 500 or 600 pages. it is a really good book. If there was an exam on DAX, this would be the prep material, right? And like I said, it's in its second edition. So it's a little bit dry, but I don't know how you write this book without being a little bit dry. But if you know for sure that you need to learn more about DAX, this is 100% the way to go. So real quick to kind of summarize, and then we've got some extra time. DAX is like a foreign language. It shouts in columns. And so you see that with how the data is stored, the error messages you get, how it's optimized, and the things that it's good at. And it's all about context. The most difficult part of working with DAX is understanding when you're dealing with a row context or a filter context and how that changes the shape of the data. And just like people using sarcastic quotes or an exclamation point or a question mark, a small change in your code can dramatically change the scope of what you're dealing with. So, so that's it. I apologize for running a little bit fast. Kevin, did we have any questions or anything?
So far, there are no questions. Although, if there are any, now's a good time to get them into chat, and we'll ask
Yeah,
away.
and I'm more than happy to talk about other stuff about being a consultant, making training courses, anything about Power BI, anything at all.
So we'll give it a couple of moments for that. In the meantime,
Yeah.
you mentioned the X functions,
Yes.
and X just means there's an expression that's allowed in there. So
Ah, okay.
yeah, you have like count, count A, and count X. The version without the expression would be count or count A, and then
Right.
count X. Just you have an expression you can add. Although I
I
do
like
like
to,
extreme.
yeah, I like to imagine it's like Extreme Teen Bible or Extreme Yogurt, like anything that was advertised in the 90s
Sure,
is my
the Mountain
headcanon.
Dew of DAX functions.
Yeah. Man, can I get like Cool Ranch Dax, something
You can
like
do
that?
that along with some Code Red DAX.
Yeah.
So even with the vamping, looks like we've got a pretty quiet audience today.
Fair enough. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, hopefully it all made sense for everyone. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think overall, DAX, you just kind of have to get your hands dirty, but it's hard because at least when I was learning it, there wasn't a lot of blogs out. Now there's a lot more stuff. But a lot of the function names are not intuitive. So for example, let's say there's a function called earlier, right? And what would you guess that earlier does? Well, when I was first learning this, I assumed it gave me the previous row, like lead or lag or something like that. Is Bing gonna cooperate? Maybe not. Oh, there we go. So instead, if you go to the earlier function, what it actually refers to is the outer row context, which can be, let's see, like, yeah, it's not, even some of the examples aren't particularly particularly great. But basically, it allows you to break out of that row context from an iterator or something else. Let's see if DAX.guide has a little bit more information. Now, one of the nice things is I haven't had to worry about this function ever since they added variables. But the point is, it's not easy to learn about. Another thing, while we're here, 2 other resources by these guys that are really cool. So the first is dax.do, and you can actually run code against, I assume, one of the Microsoft sample databases. So where is, oh, run. And so here I could probably add some sort of filter, but this looks way too complicated for me. But this is a cool way to learn. And then another resource is daxformatter.com, which I use all the time. So we can go back and we can say, okay, go to DAX formatter. And right now, this is already pretty well formatted. But if I ruin that, it'll clean it back up for me. So those are some really cool tools. And then one last one I will mention is DAX Studio. So let's say, let me open up a sample file that I'm not going to get in trouble for. So give me 1 second here. Thought I had one of the block samples somewhere. Here, we'll just be real quick with this one. So what I can do is I can go to Power BI file that I have. Here we can look at a hidden date table. That's pretty safe. And I can say evaluate. So here we've got the date table piece. And I could even run performance data and say, okay, I want to have all the timings. And so I could say I want to run that. And it would tell me, okay, here's how much time it took from the formula engine or the storage engine. So DAX Studio is also a great way to break up your queries and run them a lot more like if you're using SQL Server Management Studio or something like that. Especially when you're having to do performance tuning, it can be a real lifesaver.
So along those lines, have you used Tabular Editor?
It's on my learning list. It hasn't clicked for me yet, but I need to just get in there and play around with it because a bunch of people I respect rave about it. But usually I'm only reading about it in like specific things that you can't do in Power BI or the service. So things like calculation groups or certain types of incremental refresh or that sort of thing. So that's one of the things I'd like to learn this year, but I just haven't made the time yet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I've heard a
So
lot of,
for chat, I did drop in the links. There's Tabular Editor 2 and Tabular Editor 3. Tabular Editor 2 is the free and open source version. It will remain community supported. Tabular Editor 3 is a paid product, so there is a license fee associated with it.
Yeah, I don't think it's bad. I think it's like $100 or something. It seemed reasonable. I forget. Also, what they announced the whole like Tyndall language for version control for Power BI files, and
Yep.
I think Tabular Editor is going to be one of the ways to work with that. So it's really exciting to see where they're going with that because version control has kind of been the bane of Power BI ever since it came out. Turns out just putting everything into a zip file is great until you need to like share access to it.
Yeah, it's been a common issue.
So
All
does
right.
anyone have any questions? I'm happy to talk about my dog Tyson, anything at all.
We'll see if that entices anybody to
Right?
ask dog related questions. They're on the table.
where is that? Okay.
I'm now concerned that all the viewers are trapped in some Saw-like situation where they have to chop their own hands off to get out of the trap, and so that's why they can't type. I
Yeah,
hope
I mean,
nobody's in that.
I'm sorry that you have to learn about DAX while you're doing that. That's probably adding to your distress.
I mean, yeah, especially with like count and count A and count X, and how do you know which one to choose? And
Well, that's easy. One doesn't count non-blank values, and one doesn't count also non-blank values. I honestly can't tell you the difference between count and count A. That one's difficult. I think I ended up using sum just to make my life simpler
see,
for a
this is
recent
why we're all
project.
losing hands.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think no questions from chat, so it's probably a
Okay.
good time to wrap things up. Certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk to us
Yeah.
about DAX.
Yeah, definitely. More than happy to.
And if you want to reach out to Eugene afterwards, the information is up here, LinkedIn, Twitter, and email.
Mm-hmm.
And Eugene is, in fact, responsive to email, as I've learned in the past.
It's true. That or I just haven't learned how to filter out Kevin's stuff.
Yeah, I mean, usually people have already. That's one of the first things they do.
Yeah, I think they're adding that as one of the AI features for Outlook, but
Probably given how I rail about AI so much. But on that note, sorry, folks, if you want me railing on AI for half an hour, that's what Shop Talk is for. But for this, we're going to wrap things up for tonight. Again, Eugene, certainly appreciate you taking the time to teach us a bit about DAX.
Yeah.
And I'll say to everyone in chat, this is the last meeting of the month for April. We are back in the saddle for May, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Tuesday. And so until we see each other again, everyone, take care.
all right. Bye.